we're on the third Sunday of my 3-week Eastertide mini-series, which I'm calling In the Wake of the Resurrection. But I'm calling this one in particular, this final one, Dear Dr. Frankenstein, resurrection is participation, not resuscitation. So, before I get to Frankenstein and this idea of resurrection as participation, I want to talk a little about the reason why I think we have these unhealthy relationships with life, within earth, and with narratives that we hold so dear, even at our peril. And it continues to revolve around our difficulty evolving past our lizard brain into a more evolved, empathetic consciousness. So you know sympathy and empathy, the difference between the two of them, right? Sympathy is feeling sorry for someone and the ability to identify with their pain, to recognize their pain, and even moving to help them in some way. So we're all pretty capable of doing that pretty well. But empathy is different. It's identifying with someone's pain or suffering in a way that we're able to understand it imaginatively, with attentiveness, in order to find a deeper connection with oneself that relates to the other. In other words, it's the ability to put yourself in the place of another and understand their feelings from their perspective. Empathy opens the door to compassion and actual transformation because one has to change their normal perspective in order to practice empathy and take on a new perspective. A lot of people assume that we're empathetic, a pretty much empathetic species, but social neuroscience is actually finding out otherwise. Not that we can't be empathetic, but that it's not our go-to default emotion in relationship with others and with life and even with the earth, seeing things from those perspectives. We're not so good at it. We're really good at empathy, really good at sympathy, but empathy is a harder road to pursue. Because we tend to operate out of this lizard brain, the earliest part of our brain that functions to preserve, protect, propagate the species. It's our brainstem, tens of thousands of years of evolution. So we're still working at getting past reacting to everything from a place of fear or discomfort. And this is the neurological basis then for the problem that I think we have with our low levels of empathy and the difficulty that I think we have in living with greater kinship and understanding with all of life. Here it is stated succinctly. How do we evolve past our binary biased, zero-sum storied, and fear-triggered brainstem chemistry to cultivate and strengthen the more empathetic, higher functioning parts of the brain? In other words, how do we live into a more cooperative, empathetic, and generous relationship with life? Or how do we participate in resurrection toward the realization of God's kingdom? That's it. Well, there's a spiritual Christian solution for that. Resurrection and Dr. Frankenstein. So let me explain. You remember Jesus, he told his listeners in the Sermon on the Mount, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The great commandment, love your neighbor as you love yourself, and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It seems simple enough. As long as we're nice to everyone, as long as we're kind, then they should be nice to us. Everyone should be happy. Except I don't think that's really what Jesus was saying. We may think it's all about being nice, but how nice can we really be if we're still operating out of a fairly self-centered brainstem oriented around self-preservation and projecting our own unreflective self-stories and fears onto everyone and everything else we encounter? Because we're social creatures, we always orient ourselves around tribal, social, national, religious narratives that perpetuate and preserve our comfort, our perspective. The challenge is, we hang out with people who think like us, for the most part. The challenge is that we can't get to real change without first getting out of our own way. We can't get to resurrection. Die to self, the way that Paul puts it, the apostle. We have to die to ourselves in order to live into Christ. So later in the same Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is sitting down at the table, for example, with his disciples when they all start jockeying for position. And you're thinking, really? Weren't you just there on the mountain listening to the Sermon on the Mount, listening to all that stuff about the Beatitudes? Blessed are the poor, blessed are the merciful, blessed are the humble, do unto others. And Jesus responds to their jockeying with, those of you who would sit at the head of the table must sit at the end. And those of you who are sitting at the end must come to the front of the table. Imagine you're sitting on the front row at a Paul McCartney concert, right? You paid big bucks for those tickets. So finally, Sir Paul comes out and he addresses the crowd, and then he looks down at those on the front row and he says to everyone, actually he says, you're all going to have the best show. It's going to be the best time ever. But what I need right now for you to do is in fact, it's going to change your life. But I need for you right now is for those of you here in these front seats, I need for you to get up and switch places with everyone in the cheap seats. You're going to love it. It's not going to happen, right? Nope. You see, that's the challenge of empathy. Intentionally being attentive to others in order to imagine how you would feel in their place. It's giving up your default fear and brainstem reactions and opening up to curiosity and connection. But let me talk now a little bit more about Frankenstein, because this is where we get into this idea of putting ourselves in someone else's place. If the giving tree, well, first of all, Linda and I were watching the Mary Shelley movie, the movie called Mary Shelley. It was made in 2017, and it's about the author of the book Frankenstein, the first Prometheus, as it's called. 1818 was when she published it. And she was a young woman at the time, married Percy Shelley, the great poet. I discovered a curious insight, and what I want to suggest that if the giving tree is a curiously revealing story example about abuse, greed, and global dysfunction in the guise of sacrificial generosity, then Mary Shelley's Frankenstein may be the perfect example of an attempt to create a living, meaningful extension of humanity, but failing to recognize its shared human possibility and pain because the people lacked the empathy to see anything beyond their fears. In Shelley's novel, Dr. Victor Frankenstein, the monster's not called Frankenstein, right? In the story, it is called the thing, the monster, the strange creature. But Shelley manages to humanize the creature in all of its interactions with people. She gives it this human quality. And it has this sensitivity, this gentleness as it encounters groups of people, and it actually reflects upon their talents and the skills that they show. And it longs to sort of be a part of that, to adopt some of those qualities himself, even their kindness. But with every attempt that the monster makes to get close to them, the people are repulsed and driven away. It's not that he looks like the typical the Boris Karloff Frankenstein with the knob sticking out his neck and the cracked up face and the flat head. He actually looks a lot like an 8-foot human that's kind of lanky and a little bit misshapen, but the veins kind of protruding from his thin skin. So he's a little overwhelming to see, perhaps a bit ugly or distasteful. But every attempt he makes to connect with people, he's driven away because they're disgusted by him. So that eventually a dark and vengeful pain side of the beast begins to surface, and he then begins his killing spree and revenge. What triggers the self-destruction and chaos is not the creature itself, but ultimately the lack of empathy from those he encounters. I mean, isn't that amazing? Participation in resurrection is rooted at the very heart of our working to transform our perspectives from them to us, or transferring our perspectives from how we see things to how they see things, from the gift of nature to a renewed relationship of gratitude and giving back. In other words, leaving the spaces and the encounters that we have or that we inhabit better off than we found them. It's about the practice of empathy in order to transform fear into hope and hate into connection. There's this great quote by this writer, Valerie Carr, I saw recently online. The book's called See No Stranger, and she says, "We are indivisibly a part of one another. We share common ancestry with everyone and everything alive on earth. The air we breathe contains atoms that have passed through the lungs of ancestors long dead. Our bodies are composed of the same elements created deep inside the furnaces of stars that are long dead. We can look upon the face of anyone and anything around us and say, as a moral declaration and a spiritual, biological fact, you are a part of me I do not yet know." In the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus finishes up his ministry of justice and compassion, he finishes it up with this strange familiar parable about the goats and the sheep. And so in the end, when the judge comes back and the king comes back to judge those, what they will do is the judge will say, whenever they fed the hungry, they were feeding Jesus. Whenever they clothed the naked, they were clothing Jesus. Whenever they did anything to help another, they were doing the same to help Jesus. And what Jesus doesn't say in the parable that probably is the most telling, though. He doesn't conclude his years of teaching by saying, when the last judgment comes, the distinguishing mark between the sheep and goats will be that the sheep have all the right answers, all the right theological opinions, or that the sheep are more generous in their inner circles with friends and family, or that the sheep attend church more often. Instead, he says the sheep do 6 very specific things. They feed the hungry, they give drink to the thirsty, they welcome foreigners, they clothe the naked, they care for the sick, they visit people in prison, they reframe reality. And sadly, the climate crisis, if we allow it to continue, it will devastate all of these 6 groups, right? It's already doing so. Extreme weather, famine, and disease threaten the impoverished and the disenfranchised, first of all and most of all. And we're currently living through a refugee crisis all around the world that the climate crisis promises to create even more desperate migration in the future. So participating with an empathetic relationship with life itself is helping to participate in the life of others. But what's required is that we reframe how we see things. So conclusions. Just a couple of final points to make, and in conclusion, I want to come up first and say what I want to conclude with. First of all, resurrection is what we bring to our moments, our thoughts, our myths, our encounters, impressions of the other, whether it's at work or in our families or our church or in our nation or our world. Resurrection is what happens when we bring empathy to those moments, literally transforming fear into understanding and flight into connection. So first, don't look for the contradictions that are rooted in fear as a way to counter the deeper fear of finding connection with what scares us or those who we differ with. Don't look for the contradictions that are rooted in that fear. In other words, when we see something that discomforts us, scares us, or even angers us, or we hear an opinion or a suggestion, don't let the obvious position of its contradiction to our desire block the potential path of resurrection. The first reviewers, for example, of Shelley's book in 1818, they panned it, they tore it to shreds as a gratuitous, violent story that asked readers to sympathize with a monstrous serial killer. Well, we understand that. Almost every film remake of that story has done the same thing, emphasized that singular perspective. Be careful of what you create because it will come back and destroy you. So we ought not to be playing God, but that misses the whole point of Mary Shelley's story. We end up going to what's called the false dilemma fallacy. We go to the extreme example of the contradiction of our argument in order to disprove it, to disprove the other's point. Like the argument against atheists saying that there is no atheism because there are no atheists in a foxhole. How many of us find ourselves in foxholes? Or in this case, we can't empathize with the monster because he's a monster. Or we can't empathize with political parties that differ from us, radical groups, because they're politically radical and unapproachable. Or we can't talk to this person because she's just wrong. In 2018, the Stanford Medical School's dean pulled together a team of nurses and clergy and theologians, psychologists, to put a year-long emphasis on empathy in medicine, the importance of empathy in medicine. And they used as their metaphor and model Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It was the 200th anniversary of its publication, so they did a year of thinking about what this story is really talking about. And there is, of course, one positive conclusion to all this discussion, and that is that 200 years later, and I've obviously less than that, critiques are finally understanding what Shelley's story is about. Frankenstein didn't create a serial killer. It was Dr. Frankenstein's lack of empathy, and the villagers' lack of empathy that intensified and thwarted the strange thing in its every attempt to connect with humanity. All of its insights and possibilities and hopes that even the doctor failed to see were overwhelmed with hate and disdain and marginalization until what arose in the beast was hate and disdain and marginalization and violence. Are you seeing the connection? What the reviewers and so many remakes of the story failed to see is that what transformed the beast as potential new life into violence and death was the refusal to find a path of empathy early on in its desire for human connection. Second point then, maybe we ought to ask, what do we create in the absence of empathy? Jesus' teachings were all about seeing hope and goodness in the very contradictions of the people of his time. His parables, his beatitudes, his life all spoke to confronting those contradictions, to living with them in a way that compassion and empathy could transform them. This was at the heart of the golden rule in Jesus' great commandment, to love our neighbors as ourselves, to pray for our enemies, to do unto others as we would have them to do unto us. It's the path of empathy. What we tend to do is practice kindness in largely comfortable spaces, when it's not a bad thing. But what do we inadvertently create in our refusal to enter into the uncomfortable spaces, the difficult contradictions, like the myths of allegiance we cling to while failing to empathize with those suffering under that same allegiance, or the religious myths we cling to while failing to empathize with those that our sacred cows and family values alienate or misunderstand or marginalize? What are our narrative political allegiances fail to recognize in the other because we only see their contradiction? So here's the final thought then. We are all endowed with this possibility of profound empathy that not only connects us more deeply with what we don't understand, but also transforms these moments into joy and delight, because any time we actually overcome our natural tendency to respond out of fear, the result is actually a neurological change in our network, in our neural network. It's a release of endorphins, and we actually experience a sense of shalom, of peace. Fear is decidedly the more powerful drive in our brain, so we have to practice empathy. And here are two very quick, easy steps to begin to transform fear into empathy. And they're grounded in the Great Commandment, right? In the Golden Rule. Take 5 minutes every day to center yourself in silence by focusing on deep stress-reducing breaths, and then saying this prayer of loving kindness. I'm sending compassionate thoughts and loving thoughts to loved ones and friends, and think of them specifically. And then I'm sending thoughts of loving kindness to someone with whom I've experienced a tension recently, someone who has upset me. But don't allow the contradiction to impede the possibility of empathy. I'm sending loving thoughts to someone with whom I've had a difficult time this week. And then third, you extend loving thoughts to strangers, to specific concerns around the world, and finally to yourself, forgiving yourself where you need to and affirming yourself. Some of you will say, well, this sounds sort of like praying, or maybe even sort of like praying to God. I mean, are we sort of asking for intervention? But maybe you have this linguistic or theological or rational problem with this idea. But what I'm suggesting is that resurrection is about transforming hate and fear into love and life. And what is prayer really about but the invitation to transform ourselves in relationship to what concerns us about ourselves and our world? Praying for our enemies, after all, is not about them. It's about us. Second thing you can do to begin to really create and invite empathy into your life is to reframe the narratives we tell about others and about life. Instead of hating or fearing or taking advantage of the other or judging, regardless of if they're right or wrong, regardless of if we find ourselves more comfortable than not, think instead about what they value most in their deepest sense of connection. Where do they feel pain? Where do they feel disconnected? What would you most want others to do to you? Do that to them. Reframe the narrative. Again, don't go to the contradiction, right? Obviously, a serial killer has to be stopped. Obviously, a despot, a cruel, oppressive individual has to be stopped. Don't let that prevent you from finding empathy with your enemy, from finding empathy with those you disagree with. So in conclusion, Dr. Frankenstein, dear Dr. Frankenstein, and all the rest of those of us myth makers and life takers, resurrection is what we bring to our moments, our thoughts, and our myths, and our encounters and impressions of the others in our lives. Resurrection is what happens when we bring empathy to all our moments, literally transforming fear into understanding and flight into connection. Dr. Frankenstein, resurrection is about participation, not resuscitation.